Lisbon's sunlit streets buzzed with life, but behind the tall, ivy-clad walls of a once grand house on Rua do Século, time stood still. Few people knew who lived there. Fewer still had ever seen him. The windows remained shuttered year-round. The paint peeled in silence. If anyone walked past and looked up, they might catch a flicker of motion behind lace curtains. Nothing more. The man inside was Luis Carlos de Noronha Cabral da Camara, a name heavy with history, aristocratic, inherited. But unlike his forefathers, he was not one for society balls or political influence. He was the last flickering ember of an old noble bloodline, illegitimate, reclusive, and oddly content with fading into the background. Luis Carlos had wealth, certainly. A sprawling 12-room apartment in Lisbon, a quiet country house near Guimarães, 2 shining motorbikes he never rode, and a heavy, well-aged car that hadn't left the garage in years. His bank accounts were healthy. He lacked for nothing, except companionship. Raised without a father, passed between caretakers and distant relatives, he clung to solitude like others cling to comfort. He spoke rarely, drank often, and vanished easily. When someone did speak of him, it was often in whispers. "He's a count, you know," or something like that. Luis Carlos bore his loneliness like armor. He didn't hate people. He simply didn't trust them. Life had taught him early on that titles mean nothing, and families, especially the powerful ones, can discard their own with a coldness colder than poverty. In his youth, he had dabbled in art, rode motorcycles along the coast, and explored Lisbon's nightlife with bursts of rebellious fire. But something in him had always pulled back, some ache, some distrust, a haunting sense that he wasn't really welcome anywhere. Even among the rich, Luis Carlos felt like a ghost. By the time he was in his late 20s, the lights in his soul had dimmed, and yet there was something quietly brewing, an idea, strange, simple, and bold. One afternoon in 1988, as Lisbon buzzed outside, Luis Carlos stood up from his armchair and put on a tailored coat that hadn't been worn in years. He looked into a mirror that barely recognized him. Then he walked down the street, unnoticed, a ghost in human clothes. He had a destination, a small notary office tucked between a bakery and a tailor shop. What he would do there would remain hidden for 2 decades. The notary's office smelled faintly of old paper, tobacco, and polished wood. Afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, casting quiet shadows across dusty volumes of legal records and yellowing forms. A young clerk behind the desk looked up as Luis Carlos entered, his polished shoes echoing softly on the parquet floor. "Boa tarde," Luis Carlos said, his voice calm, controlled. "I need to write a will." The clerk blinked. Men like this, dressed in an elegant, outdated jacket, face unreadable, didn't often walk in unannounced. A nod, a phone call, and a senior notary appeared, older, with spectacles low on his nose. "What sort of will?" the notary asked. Luis Carlos smiled faintly. "One that surprises people." Minutes later, Luis Carlos was seated in the notary's private office, a directory of Lisbon phone numbers placed before him like a book of fate. The notary raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Luis Carlos flipped the directory open to a random page. He pulled out a pen and began pointing. "That one," he said, "and that one. Skip 3, choose the next, then the one below it." No explanations, just calm, measured selections. One by one, 70 strangers' names were written down. Ordinary people with no idea their futures had just been quietly rewritten. The notary glanced at the growing list. family will not contest this?" he asked carefully. Luis Carlos chuckled dryly. "There is no family." His voice betrayed no sadness. If anything, it carried a quiet defiance. These strangers, chosen without bias, status, or expectation, were now the heirs to a fortune that had lived in silence for too long. The final signature came with a whisper of the pen. The notary sealed the envelope, locked it in the office safe, and glanced once more at the peculiar man across from him. "You understand this is permanent," he said. "I do," replied Luis Carlos, standing to leave. "And they will too, someday." As the door closed behind him, the notary stared at the list. Names without faces, stories yet unwritten. He didn't know it then, but he'd just witnessed one of the strangest and most human moments in modern inheritance history. Luis Carlos stepped back onto the street, sunlight flickering off his silver cufflinks. Lisbon bustled around him, unaware. He walked slowly back to his home behind the shutters, carrying nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a plan set in motion. No one, not the notary, not the city, not the 70 strangers, could guess how deeply this act would ripple when the time came. And the time would come. Years passed, yet Luis Carlos's life changed little. The shutters stayed closed. The mail piled up neatly, mostly unopened. Dust settled like snow on heirloom furniture. Sometimes a neighbor glimpsed him through a crack in the curtains, reading in his study, sipping something amber from a heavy glass. Lisbon grew louder, faster, younger, but within the walls of his 12-room apartment, it was always a different era. No parties, no visitors, just silence. His staff, what little of it remained, knew better than to ask questions. A cleaner came once a week. A grocer dropped off goods every Thursday, never once invited inside. Even his lawyer hadn't heard from him in over a decade. Only Aníbal Castro, his old friend and occasional drinking companion, had any inkling of the will he had written so long ago. But even Aníbal was unsure if Luis Carlos still remembered it. Beneath the quiet, however, a strange peace had taken hold of the aristocrat. His rebellion, small as it was, had been written in ink. He had escaped the grasp of the state. He had denied distant relatives. He had made a choice that no one could predict, and that, for a man who lived under the shadow of old expectations, was everything. He rarely left home in his final years, his once vibrant eyes slowly dimming. He watched the world through windows instead, watching Lisbon evolve, age, dance, and forget. He saw buildings rise where his friends once lived. He saw new names on old cafes. He witnessed, day by day, the quiet erasure of the past he belonged to. But never once did he alter the will. He aged alone. No hospital visits, no caretakers, no dramatic final words, just a stillness, a fading. When he passed away in October of 2007, it was the housekeeper who found him, seated in his favorite armchair, wrapped in a wool blanket, a book resting on his chest. The police came, then the medics. The process was clinical, cold. But something strange happened not long after. Letters were drafted, sealed envelopes prepared. The notary, long since retired but still alive, was contacted to confirm the document's authenticity. And somewhere in a city where he hadn't spoken to anyone in years, 70 names, scattered, unsuspecting, and utterly random, were pulled from dusty records. The world was about to collide with a secret written 2 decades ago, but no one knew it yet. It began quietly, a rustle of paper, a knock on a door, a confused glance at an envelope with unfamiliar lettering. From one corner of Lisbon to another, Across cafes, bookshops, factories, and humble apartments, people began receiving the strangest mail they'd ever seen. Some were handwritten, others bore the mark of a law firm. All were official, sealed, mysterious. Inside each was the same message, reworded for 70 strangers. You have been named a beneficiary in the estate of the late Luis Carlos de Noronha Cabral de Camara. You are requested to contact the executor for further details regarding your inheritance. The first reactions were predictable: suspicion, disbelief, even anger. "Some kind of scam," muttered a bus driver as he crumpled his letter. "Who? I've never even heard of this man," whispered a young mother, checking again for some fine print, some catch. A retired seamstress named Helena shook as she read hers. At 70, she lived alone with her cats and had no known ties to wealth or nobility. She thought perhaps it was a cruel mistake, or worse, a trick meant to humiliate the poor. But the letters kept coming. Phone calls were made. Legal assistants answered, patient and calm, repeating the same message. Yes, it is real. Yes, it's binding. No, you were not selected because of merit or need. You were chosen at random from a 1988 phone directory. The randomness only deepened the mystery. Reporters caught wind. Headlines began to swirl. Aristocrat leaves fortune to strangers chosen at random. Modern-day lottery? Lisbon resident stunned by inheritance. Luis Carlos, silent in life, had become infamous in death. At the center of it all stood the executor of his estate, carefully handling the list. One by one, each name was confirmed, each person was located, and slowly, bewildered strangers began making their way into an office lined with old wood, waiting for explanations they might never truly understand. Some arrived in wrinkled shirts, gripping their letters like lifelines. Others wore their Sunday best, hearts pounding with quiet hope. None had ever met Luis Carlos. None had the faintest clue why fate had chosen them, but one by one they signed papers, and one by one their lives began to shift. Inside the executor's office, curiosity mixed with disbelief like perfume and dust. Some heirs whispered to each other in line, trying to piece together who this mysterious man could have been. Others sat in stunned silence, clutching the documents that now named them heirs to a fortune. But no matter how many times it was explained, the same question echoed again and again. Why us? The executor could only answer with a shrug, and the official story. You were in the phone book. He chose you randomly, no tricks, no strings. To the heirs, Luis Carlos was a phantom, a stranger, and yet he'd thought of them in his own strange way nearly 20 years before. When the legal process concluded, the veil began to lift. 70 people, men and women from every walk of life, began receiving the first real glimpses of what they had inherited. They were led through the doors of Luis Carlos's grand apartment, now unsealed. What they found was breathtaking. The 12-room residence in the heart of Lisbon was like a museum of forgotten privilege. Ornate wallpaper still clung to the walls. Chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with fading frescoes. Books lined shelves from floor to ceiling, untouched but arranged with precision. Antiques, tables, clocks, mirrors, each whispered stories in silence. One room contained a motorcycle, polished but never moved. Another, a collection of vintage rifles. And in a back room, hidden behind a velvet curtain, an easel stood with an unfinished canvas, just a few wild, chaotic brushstrokes across it, his only visible attempt at art. The country house near Guimarães revealed a different kind of solitude, simpler, sunlit, dotted with olive trees. There, a rusted table still bore the mark of a solitary dinner. One plate, one glass, one fork. It was clear now. Luis Carlos hadn't just left behind wealth. He'd left behind a question, a riddle, an invisible footprint across their lives. The heirs began to meet, informally at first, over coffee, at cafes, in parks. They shared their stories. A woman who worked in a shoe store, a mechanic, a retired librarian, all of them, utterly ordinary. None of them rich, none of them prepared, and yet they were all forever changed by a man they never met. Some used their share to fix leaky roofs. Others paid off decades of debt. A few traveled for the first time in their lives. One man, an aspiring writer, used his windfall to finally quit his job and chase a dream. In scattered corners of Lisbon, Luis Carlos's name began to mean something, not for who he was, but for what he had done. The man who never let anyone in had, in death, opened his door to 70 souls. The list was real, typed on yellowed paper, edges curled, names fading but legible, 70 of them, each separated by nothing more than chance and ink. The executor kept it in a folder marked Cabral da Camara, Final Will, stored now in a silent drawer beneath layers of legal dust. In the weeks that followed, Lisbon hummed with whispers. Journalists traced the story like a puzzle, desperate to define Luis Carlos. Some called him eccentric, others lonely. A few labeled him cruel for playing roulette with inheritance. But no one could deny the poetry of it, a nobleman choosing strangers instead of blood. One woman, after receiving her share, disappeared from her apartment overnight. Neighbors said she left a note on her door. "Thank you, Luis. I'll make it count." A young man with nothing but debts bought a second-hand violin and played for hours beneath the very windows Luis Carlos had once stared out of in silence. A family from the outskirts moved into the country house, planting a garden where weeds had claimed the soil. In a bookstore, a thin man with tired eyes walked in and asked if they had any records on Portuguese aristocracy. When the clerk asked why, he simply said, "He left me something. I want to know who he was." A group of heirs gathered once on the steps of the apartment building. They said nothing, just stood there, staring up at the empty windows, the shutters still closed. In the quiet of the city, his name stopped being a headline and became a question. Somewhere, in the soft rustle of Lisbon's breeze, the past rearranged itself around 70 strangers who had never meant to meet, never meant to matter in the same story, but now carried pieces of a man they never knew,